My name is Morgan. I was 15 years old when they sold me, not as a person, not even as a name, but as Lot 47. A number on a piece of paper, ink pressed into parchment like a brand, like I was livestock being traded at a county fair. And what they bought, what they thought they were getting, was something they could define, something they could measure and control. But I was never what they expected. I was born into a body that refused to obey the rules of their world, a body neither fully one thing nor the other, carrying within it a truth so uncomfortable that even the doctors who examined me could not bring themselves to write it clearly in their reports. I existed in the space between their categories, and that space, I would learn, was the most dangerous place in the entire state of Georgia. I know this is a lot to carry, and I haven't even told you the worst of it yet. Before I go any further, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. If you had been in my place, 15 years old, sold as a number, carrying a secret that could get you killed, would you have spoken up when that candle was burning low and that man was looking at you waiting for an answer? Leave your answer in the comments. Tell me where you're from. If this story is already touching something inside you, subscribe, because there are more stories like this one, and every comment, every like, every new subscriber helps keep them alive. It helps put food on the table for the people who gather and tell them. Now, let me take you back to Georgia, back to those white columns, back to the beginning of everything. There's something I need to tell you, something I carried for 13 years before I ever allowed myself to speak it aloud. By the time I finally stood in the cold gray light of 1871, looking at my own reflection in a cracked mirror in a rented room in Philadelphia, I barely recognized the woman staring back at me. But she was alive. That counted for everything. What happened inside the walls of Blackwood Mansion, the secrets buried beneath those white columns, the slow poison slipped into my evening tea, the letters hidden behind loose bricks, and a man who gave up everything he owned so that I could breathe free air. None of it should have been possible. And yet, if what I'm about to tell you touches something deep inside you, something you've carried quietly yourself, I want you to leave a comment below and tell me where you're from. Your support keeps these stories alive. It puts food on the table. Subscribe if you want to hear more. Now let me take you back to the beginning. Blackwood Mansion sat at the end of a long dirt road, lined with oak trees so old their roots had cracked the earth open like broken promises. Spanish moss hung from every branch, swaying in the Georgia heat like gray curtains drawn over something shameful. From a distance, the place looked like a painting. White columns, a wide porch, roses climbing the iron railings. Beautiful the way a trap is beautiful before it closes. Up close, it smelled of candle wax and something older underneath, something rotting behind the walls that no amount of lemon oil or cedar could cover. The floorboards in the east corridor creaked at exactly the same pitch every night around 2 in the morning, and after my first week there, I understood that sound was not random. It was the house breathing, exhaling the weight of everything it had witnessed and refused to forget. My days had a rhythm that was designed to erase me. I woke before sunrise, when the air still carried the cool memory of night, and I worked until the last candle in the main house was extinguished. I cleaned fireplaces, pressed linen, carried trays up staircases that seemed to grow longer the more exhausted I became. The other enslaved people on the property kept a careful distance from me at first, not out of cruelty, but out of a fear I recognized. I was different in ways they could sense but not name, and in a world where being different meant being destroyed, proximity to me felt like standing too close to lightning. I ate alone most evenings, at the corner of a long wooden table in the kitchen, listening to the cicadas outside the screen door, and the distant sound of the Colonel's gramophone playing somewhere above my head. The wound I carried was older than Blackwood, older than the auction block where they had held my chin up so buyers could examine my teeth. I had been separated from my mother at the age of 9, on a Tuesday morning in September, in the middle of a field in South Carolina while the cotton was still white and full on the stalks. She had pressed her thumb against my forehead before they pulled her away. Not a kiss, not a word, just that firm, warm pressure, like she was trying to leave a mark that no one could sell. I never found out what happened to her. I looked for her name in every document I could access once I learned to read. I never found it. That absence lived inside my chest like a stone that had grown too large to pass, and it shaped every decision I made inside those walls. Every risk, every silence, every calculated move in a game I had not chosen but refused to lose. The night everything changed began with a book left open on a table. I had been summoned to the colonel's private study to clear the dinner tray he had forgotten there, a task so small it should have taken 30 seconds and left no mark on either of our lives. But when I entered the room, Harrison Blackwood was asleep in his armchair, a glass of bourbon tilted dangerously in his loosened grip, and on the mahogany desk in front of him lay an open copy of Milton's Paradise Lost, candlelight flickering across the pages. I set down the tray. I should have left. Instead, my eyes moved to the text without my permission. A hunger so old and so disciplined, I had learned to hide it the way other people hide fever. My lips moved silently over the words, and that was the moment the colonel opened his eyes and saw me reading. The room went absolutely still. He did not shout. He did not reach for the bell to call the overseer. He simply watched me with an expression I had never seen on the face of a white man in Georgia. Not anger, not amusement, not the cold calculation of someone calculating value. It was recognition. Like a man who has been speaking into an empty room for years and suddenly realizes there was someone there the entire time, listening. He asked me, quietly, if I understood what I had read. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. To admit literacy was to invite punishment, possibly worse. To deny it was to extinguish the only thing I had ever truly owned. I stood at the exact center of the most dangerous choice of my life, and I was 16 years old, and the candle between us was burning low, and I opened my mouth and told him the truth. He did not punish me. What he did instead was far more complicated and infinitely more perilous. He began leaving books outside my door, first Milton, then Plato, then a worn copy of Mary Wollstonecraft that felt like holding a coal in my bare hands. Within 3 months, our sessions had moved to the study at midnight, when the house was as close to sleeping as it ever got. We spoke about philosophy, about the nature of the soul, about whether a society built on contradiction could sustain itself. He spoke to me as though my thoughts had weight, as though I occupied space in the moral universe. And while that recognition was the closest thing to dignity I had experienced since my mother's thumb pressed against my forehead in that September field, I knew, with the cold clarity that had kept me alive this long, that it was also building something that the world around us would never allow to stand. Something was coming. I could feel it the way you feel a storm before the sky changes color. The first sign of danger arrived on a Wednesday morning in the shape of a black leather bag. Dr. Elliot Marsh stepped out of a hired carriage wearing a gray coat and the expression of a man who has never once doubted his own authority. He had been invited by Constance Blackwood, not the colonel, under the pretense of conducting a routine health examination of the property's enslaved population. But when his eyes found me across the yard, something shifted in his face, a sharpening, the way a hunting dog lifts its nose when the wind changes direction. He examined the others quickly, perfunctorily, the way a man checks items off a list he already considers finished. When he reached me, he slowed down. He asked questions the others had not been asked. He wrote in his notebook for a very long time. Before he left, he spoke quietly to Constance on the porch, and she nodded twice, slowly, without looking back in my direction. That nod hollowed something out of me. That night I could not sleep. I lay on my narrow cot and stared at the ceiling and allowed myself, for the first time in months, to be completely honest with my own fear. I knew what Dr. Marsh had seen. I had lived my entire life managing the way people reacted to the truth of my body, the confusion, the disgust, the fascination that was somehow worse than both. In the world of 1854, there was no language that protected me, no legal category that acknowledged my existence as fully human. I was, to men like Marsh, a specimen, a medical anomaly to be transferred, studied, documented, and ultimately reduced to a footnote in a journal that would sit on a shelf in Richmond while I ceased to exist as anything resembling a person. I pressed my hand flat against my sternum and breathed slowly and made myself think clearly. Fear was a luxury I could not afford to hold for long, but I let myself feel it that night, every cold, consuming inch of it. 2 weeks after Marsh's visit, the colonel stopped leaving books outside my door. The midnight sessions ended without explanation, without farewell. The silence that replaced them was a different kind of silence. Not the comfortable quiet of two people thinking in the same room, but the brittle silence of something broken and left where it fell. I later understood that Constance had confronted him. I did not know the exact words she used, but I could reconstruct them from the new coldness in the house, from the way the other servants averted their eyes when I passed, from the extra tasks that began appearing on my daily list, tasks designed not to be useful but to be exhausting, to leave me too depleted to think. She was not threatened by romance. She was threatened by the possibility that I had developed something far more dangerous inside those walls than desire. She was threatened by the possibility that I mattered. Then the letters began arriving from Richmond. I was not supposed to know about them, but Margaret Chen, a quiet, careful woman who managed the household accounts and whose own story of how she came to be at Blackwood was one she never told in full, had a gift for being invisible in rooms where important things were said. She slipped me a folded note one evening between the folds of a clean tablecloth, her fingers pressing mine for just a half-second longer than necessary. The note contained 3 words in her small, precise handwriting: "Richmond wants you." I stood in the linen closet with that paper in my hand and felt the walls of the mansion contract around me. Marsh had filed a report. The transfer request had been approved. I had perhaps 30 days before a second carriage arrived at the end of that oak-lined road, and this time it would be coming specifically for me. It was during those 30 days that I discovered I was pregnant. I sat with that knowledge alone for 4 days before I allowed it to become real in my mind. In a world that had already decided I was impossible, that my body defied the categories their science depended upon, this pregnancy was not merely a personal revelation. It was a theological argument, a biological declaration that no court in the Confederacy had a framework to process. I felt, simultaneously, a joy so fierce it frightened me, and a terror so complete it had no edges. This child was proof of something. I did not yet know proof of what, but I understood with absolute certainty that if Constance Blackwood discovered it before I could act, neither the child nor I would survive long enough for anyone to ask the question. The arsenic, I would later learn, had already begun. Small amounts. Patient. Disguised in the chamomile tea she began sending to my room each evening with a smile I should have recognized sooner as something other than kindness. Margaret found the letter on a Thursday afternoon in January, tucked inside a hollowed-out Bible on the 3rd shelf of Constance's private sitting room. She had been called to dust the shelves, a task Constance had never assigned her before, and never assigned her again. And something about the Bible's placement, slightly forward from the others, slightly tilted, spoke to Margaret's instincts the way a crooked picture frame speaks to someone who notices what most people walk past. She brought it to me that same evening, folded inside a dish towel, her face carrying the particular stillness of someone who has read something they cannot unread. The letter was written in Constance's careful, slanted hand, addressed to Dr. Marsh. It detailed everything: the arsenic, the dosage, the timeline, the language she used to frame my deterioration as a natural consequence of my constitutional deficiencies. She had been poisoning me for 6 weeks. She called it mercy. She called it maintaining order. She called it protecting the legacy of the Blackwood name from a corruption it could not survive. Reading those words connected everything I had dismissed as coincidence or exhaustion into a single, terrible architecture of intent. The chamomile tea, the trembling in my hands I had attributed to nerves, the nausea I had told myself was the pregnancy, the headaches that arrived each evening like clockwork and departed each morning just slowly enough to leave me diminished. Constance had not acted out of passion or jealousy. She had acted out of the same cold administrative logic that ran every other system inside that mansion. I was a problem to be managed, a variable to be eliminated before it could destabilize the equation she had spent her entire adult life constructing and defending. And the most devastating part, the detail that made the floor feel liquid beneath my feet, was that the letter mentioned the child. She knew. She had known for at least 2 weeks before I had allowed myself to fully accept it. And her timeline had been adjusted accordingly. She was not just trying to erase me. She was trying to erase the proof that I had ever been anything more than Lot 47. I laid the letter flat on my cot that night and stared at it until the candle burned down to nothing and the room went completely dark. In that darkness, I mapped every option I had with the same precision I had taught myself to apply to everything that mattered. I could go to the Colonel, but to do so was to place the full weight of my survival in the hands of a man who, however genuine his recognition of my humanity had been, was still legally my owner, still bound by a social architecture that would demand he choose his name over my life. I could attempt to flee alone, but I was 6 weeks into a poisoning, visibly weakened, carrying a child, in the middle of a Georgia winter with no papers, no money, and a transfer order already signed and waiting in Richmond. I could give the letter to someone with legal standing, but in 1858, in the Confederate South, there was no courtroom, no magistrate, no institution on earth that would accept the testimony of an enslaved person against the wife of a colonel. Every door I examined had the same lock, and I held a key that fit none of them. It was Margaret who carried the letter to the colonel, not because I asked her to, but because she understood, with the quiet wisdom of someone who had survived by reading rooms more carefully than most people read books, that the only possible move left was to make Harrison Blackwood confront the truth of what his house had become. I did not sleep that night. I sat on the floor with my back against the wall and my hand pressed flat against my abdomen, and I made a decision about who I was. I decided that I would not beg. I would not diminish myself to fit the dimensions of their mercy. If I survived, I would survive as the full and complete person I had always been, the one my mother had marked with her thumb, the one who had read Milton by candlelight, the one whose body had defied every category they tried to press her into. And if I did not survive, then at least I would not have spent my last hours making myself smaller to make them more comfortable. That decision, I think, was the moment I truly became free. Everything after was simply geography. The night of February 14th, 1858, was the coldest Georgia had seen in 11 years. I know this because I felt every degree of it through the thin walls of the servants' quarters as I listened to the sound of the colonel's voice rising and falling in the main house. Words I could not distinguish, but whose weight I could feel through the floorboards beneath my feet. Margaret stood beside me in the dark, her hand wrapped around mine, both of us perfectly still, the way animals go still when the forest changes pitch around them. Then came the sound of something breaking, glass or porcelain, or perhaps the last pretense that the Blackwood household had ever been anything other than what it truly was. Constance's voice cut through the walls like a blade, high and precise and utterly without remorse, and then the colonel's voice dropped so low it disappeared entirely, and that silence was louder than anything that had come before it. Margaret squeezed my hand once. It was time to move. We left through the root cellar, the way Margaret had planned for 3 days without telling me until the moment required it. The cold hit us like a physical blow the instant we cleared the cellar door. A darkness so complete and a cold so absolute that the world felt reduced to the sound of our own breathing and the crunch of frost beneath our feet. We moved north along the tree line, away from the road, away from the lanterns, away from everything that had ever called itself my life. Behind us, through the bare trees, I saw a single light burning in the colonel's study window. It did not move. It did not follow. Harrison Blackwood sat at his desk that night and wrote for 7 hours without stopping. A full confession. 31 pages in his own hand, detailing the poisoning, the transfer order, the letter, the truth of who I was and what had been done to me, and what he had failed to prevent, and what he now refused to allow to be buried alongside everything else that mansion had already consumed. He sealed it and addressed it to a newspaper editor in Philadelphia. Then he walked to Constance's room and told her what he had done. By morning, the document was already on its way north, and so was I. I am 54 years old as I write this, in a rented room in Philadelphia, where the window looks out onto a street full of people who do not know my name or my history or the number they once assigned me at auction. My daughter is 13 years old. She reads voraciously Milton, Wollstonecraft, and last week a collection of abolitionist essays that she argued about with her teacher with a precision and confidence that made my chest ache with something I have no adequate word for. She does not know every detail of how she came to exist in this world. She knows enough. She knows that someone loved us enough to stay behind so we could move forward. She knows that her mother was never Lot 47. Not really. Not in any way that mattered. What I learned inside those walls, beneath those white columns and that Spanish moss and that smell of wax and rot, is that survival is not the opposite of dignity. You do not have to choose between staying alive and staying whole. The world will tell you that you do. The world is wrong. Harrison Blackwood's confession was published in March of 1858. Constance was never formally prosecuted. The law protected her in the ways it always protected women of her station. But the story lived. It traveled. It found people who needed to hear it. And now, 13 years later, it has found you. Whatever cage they have built around you, whatever number they have tried to reduce you to, I want you to remember that the most radical thing you can do is to remain, completely and without apology, exactly who you are. That is what no document can transfer. That is what no poison can reach. That is the only thing, in the end, that was ever truly mine.